So welcome everybody. My name is Camille Brown. I'm the Assistant Curator here at the Phillips Collection. I'm pleased to welcome you to a conversation, Community Posters in 1968 and Today. We are joined by the guest curator of Lou Stovall, the Museum Workshop, Will Stovall, art historian, Dr. Melanee Harvey, curator, Natalie Campbell, and artist and printmaker, Joseph Orzal. A little bit about them. Will Stovall is an artist and painter who has worked in the book medium. He holds a PhD from Yale University with a dissertation on the institutional imagination of philosopher Jürgen Habermas. He is currently a candidate for the MFA in painting at Bard College. Dr. Melanee Harvey is associate professor of art history in the Department of Art at Howard University. She earned a BA from Spelman College and went on to Boston University, where she received her MA and PhD in American art and architectural history. She has also published extensively on Black arts movement artists, including Faith Ringgold, James Phillips, and African commune of bad relevant artist Afrocobra. She is currently working on her book project, which will explore the architectural history of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination across material and visual artifacts. The book will provide a social material and visual history that recovers the architectural and aesthetic discourse among this community of African Americans throughout the 19th and 20th centuries that permanently altered the American landscape. I can't wait for it. Natalie Campbell is an art historian and arts worker, now exhibits coordinator of the DC Public Library. She studied art history at Hunter College, CUNY, and lectured in art history at the Corcoran School of Arts and Design at George Washington University in MICA. She has curated exhibitions at venues including Smack Mellon, Nicole Clagsbrunn Gallery, and the Center for Book Arts, all in New York, as well as numerous temporary, collaborative, and publication-based projects outside of traditional exhibition spaces. As a project manager for contemporary artists and galleries, she has overseen complex video, performance, installation, and print productions, coordinating the expertise of numerous performers, technicians, fabricators, and designers. And Joseph Orzal is a Filipino-Mexican-American painter, sculptor, curator, and writer active in DC and Baltimore. He co-founded the infamous Nomu Nomu, a revolutionary intersectional artistic organization active in the United States, working towards liberation for broader society from perpetual systems of oppression and class domination that permeate throughout the art world. His work is often political. So, Will, I think we will kick it off with you.
Thank you, Camille. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think this is the perfect way to celebrate the second to last day, because I think this panel, we're really here to, I think from different sides, kind of reflect where this exhibit is still existing even after it physically closes tomorrow here. So one key thing is the amazing exhibit at the DC Public Library, the MLK branch, where there's on the fourth floor just an amazing multimedia presentation of DC art and culture from, where does it begin, early 1960s into today.
Right.
So we have Natalie here. Hopefully we'll speak about the community poster and in that context, how it relates to the exhibit here. So there are two posters from the exhibit, or the Peace Corps poster on the exhibit, in the exhibit upstairs is
also on view at the MLK Library, yeah.
Exactly,
and Do Your Own Thing, which is not upstairs, right?
Right. Yeah. But it's a wonderful way to see how that poster exists in an even larger context. So, and part of that exhibit too is posters by Joseph and Nomu Nomu, and we have a short clip of the posters in action from summer 2020, which is really something I wish I could have from 1968. The poster's included here. There's an amazing art historian, Maria McWhorter, who some of you know, who found documentary photo from the Howard Hilltop newspaper of Charles Cassell's campaign poster printed by my dad and Lloyd from '68 on an actual polling site outdoor. And so that's kind of the one link to the poster in its actual kind of context and its actual kind of direct use outdoor in public spaces. And so we have a way to see it, kind of see that interaction in an amazing way, because what was taking place summer 2020 is so amazing. And we have Melanee, who's going to provide us with an amazing art historical kind of glue for the discussion of the community poster, which will expand the historical frame out of this context to just build out what, just an understanding of really what the poster as a medium and a political, cultural, art historical context is. So I'm so thankful to have you here for to provide your brilliance and expertise to really help us understand the poster as an art object, a cultural object. And Camille, this exhibit, Lou Stovall, the Museum Workshop, exists in a continuum with, I'm thinking Alma Thomas's wonderful exhibit and David Driscoll that took place at the Phillips last year. So I really hope, I'm so glad for your voice to be here to just talk about what this exhibit means for the Phillips, how it works. And so this is kind of a dream team for me to, I'm so thankful to be with everyone here. And just one thing, this is kind of, I was just thinking, the last panel discussion my dad was on was in so April 2018, organized by Ruth Fine at the National Gallery of Art. And he was on a panel with Sylvia Snowden, David Driscoll, Sam Gilliam, Keith Morrison, and his contribution. He wanted to, when it was his moment to speak, was to deliver a paper that he had written about James Wells at his printmaking workshop with Charles Alston in Harlem. And I really think it really struck me that when that my dad and being invited to speak about his work really wanted to speak about this workshop that predated him. He was, I think, just even before he was born in the early 30s, this workshop existed in Harlem. So I think that was the time he kind of was on his mind and wanted to think back to. And for me, the 60s and the early 70s in DC is really the time that has captured my imagination and interests for so much. So this is really what I want to be talking about and thinking about. So I'm really thankful. So after this, so we have our video.
Yes, I think we'll kick off with the clip that you mentioned of the community poster in action.
Come on! That's it! No justice, no peace! That's it! That's it!
it's done. That was supposed to happen. So, Joseph, can you tell us a little bit about how this came about?
Oh. It's a long story, but I guess it started with Mochella, with Yachty, and for a while I was the creative director of Mochella, and we wanted to do a campaign based. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, we wanted to do a campaign, like a fake campaign for Yachty, because he had a single called Yachty for Mayor, or Marion Barry. So I came up with this like thing called like the People's Poster Platform Project, which was a collaboration with Chicha Posters in Peru. And it was basically like creating a fake campaign with 7 points that he was going to run on. And I don't even remember them, but it was like Long Live Go-Go, We Keep Us Safe, ICE Out of DC, Homes for People Not for Profit, Yachty for Mayor, Invest in Black Youth, something else. And then, so we collaborated with Chicha Posters in Peru. They made a bunch of posters. I mean, and there were these parallels, right? Because Chicha music is like often referred to as like a street music that like a lot of rich people don't like. And there's like a good bridge between go-go and Chicha. Then pandemic happened, and then 2020 stuff happened, and then the posters became even more relevant. And so, yeah, what happened here was, I mean, we were wheat pasting them all over DC, and then, yeah, it was just a way to like get a message across to the people while, you know, protesting and just playing music. So it was like a big part of how we got our messaging across and politicized the movement.
So I think that, you know, in 2020, we're seeing like the importance of the community poster. So I think it would be interesting if we could go back a bit with Melanee and talk about the kind of historical context of the community poster.
So you all can hear me. I did prepare a few slides to kind of swiftly walk us through that create what I see as a historical context, but also like a spectrum, right? A spectrum of different visual approaches that mark DC over time. I'm a specialist in African American art history, but also have spent a great amount of time studying African American art communities and architectural communities in Washington, DC. So I thought it was really important for me to begin with two objects that are in Moreland Spingarn's collection at Howard University that represent an element that's still present in community poster practice, and that is counter-narratives. Post-emancipation, these chromolithographs and photolithographs were created to promote a different type of narrative about cultural uplift, self-determination amongst African Americans at the same time that the lost cause narrative is gaining traction in the late 19th and early 20th century. So thinking about counter narratives. But then I'm jumping ahead to the early 20th century, thinking about this famous photograph of Harlem and that flag of a man was lynched yesterday. And thinking about how this photograph really embodies how community posters and graphic traditions really transform the urban landscape into a site of critique, interrogation, and activist uplift as well. And of course, I want to bring in an example from Washington, D.C. from the 1930s, a poster, a broadside that's mobilizing African American communities in Washington, D.C. to protest People's Drug Store. And of course, this takes us to a high point of the collaborations between Lloyd McNeil and Lou Stovall. And I mean, just those two names together for me in my study of DC Black art, they are a collaborative dream team. You know, a lot has actually been made about Afro-Cobra and the posters that they do late 60s, early 70s. But when we look at these images, we realize that these are a product of Lloyd McNeil and Lou Stovall working together throughout the 60s, from their time at Howard through their time just engaging with the city. And I'm sure we will speak a lot about Lou Stovall, but one thing I did want to do is bring Lloyd McNeil's voice into this. And so I wanted to read a brief passage from his MFA thesis from Howard University in 1963. He says, quote, "If I may be allowed to speculate about my direction in art, I should say that my concern may always be with people. And because of this, what I will paint will specifically be concerned with the figure either positively or negatively. And by this dichotomy, I mean positively, where the figure is representationally or abstractly in view, and negatively, where the figure is absent, but in a situation is burdened with figural relationships as contrasted with naturescapes." I know it was chunky, but it was good because we see really in their aesthetic choices the way both Lou Stovall and Lloyd McNeil are wrestling with figuration at a time where we're trying to understand what humanity is in the context of race and civil rights, and soon Black power and indigenous movements as well. So this for me becomes a high point, and we see that aesthetic dialogue also with this as well. And again, for me, the revelation that I emphasize to my students is before we can even understand the impact of Afro-Cobra, we have to understand the foundation that Lou Stovall and Lloyd McNeil established in their collaborative efforts in Washington, D.C. with the workshop. And again, they're creating at a time where this aesthetic of go-go posters is already existing in the city. And I would say that this has more differences than similarities with other kind of entertainment graphic traditions like the Hatch Collection, or even there's a global poster collection at MICA, right? Globe. Yeah, Globe. All three are Globe. Thank you very much. They are. So thinking about how the community poster aesthetic that Lou Stovall and McNeil developed, how this existed amongst these. And also, I love this image on the left because we see that it becomes a space of marking one's presence and a document of presence, event, and time. I also want to think about the community poster as a kind of aesthetic point of departure for artists like Renee Stout. I think when we think about the kind of omnipresence of community posters in DC, it kind of keeps before her mind this kind of graphic legacy that then she thinks through New Orleans graphics. But in my mind, her working in DC, she can't get to this without constantly being confronted with the DC poster aesthetic. And then last but not least, what we've lived with, like in the last 5 years. And I really do think of this is my junior high classmate. We went to junior high together. So please allow me to call him Joey. What Joey has been doing alongside Absurdly Well, right? Where they're maintaining that aesthetic commitment, that interest in aesthetic innovation that can happen in a community poster with the kind of painterly expressions here. And I would also argue that these images and Joey's images exist in this spectrum, where we also have images like divorce culture that play around with character in a way that may be uncomfortable for people, right? But to me, lack the kind of aesthetic interest that Joey and Absurdly maintain and carry over from Lou Stovall in the workshop. And that's me.
That's wonderful.
So I figured I'd open up discussion with like a huge, big question. We are living in an increasingly polarized and digital world. How do you feel like the role of the community poster has changed from 1968 to today? Or has it?
That is a large question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I could kick that question to Joseph by just with the idea of collaboration, which we said was one of the things we wanted to talk about today, because just thinking about when you started to explain the genesis of the go-go posters at being a collaboration with an artist and organizer in Peru, right? And you think about the nature Lou Stovall and Lloyd McNeil's collaboration, like collaboration alone has an entirely different meaning in the digital kind of global age. So that's one thing that comes to mind, and I'm curious what you all think. What else comes to mind for you?
Can you repeat? Sorry, because there's a lot of thoughts with that.
Repeat my question.
Yeah.
So, how do you think that the community poster has changed from 1968 to today, or do you think that it's changed, the role?
It's definitely changed, and because of, I think COVID was a big impact in how we relate, But before that, I think even seeing the go-go posters, that was the primary form of communication. It was like the assumption that people are moving in the streets, and the way you get their attention is by creating these bright posters. And now, obviously it's all shifted to the digital form, and that has really impacted the way. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how, because it's just purely consumption now, and people, it goes in and out of people's brains like that, and so there's just a lack of reverence for the image, and so now, I guess it's due for a comeback. People need to get back into the streets and produce work for the public. I just think in the past few years it hasn't been there.
I think to kind of extend that, Joseph, again, growing up in DC, we were moving through the DC streets in 97, 98. So it's interesting to think about the role that community posters and really go-go posters to a certain extent played at a time where gentrification hadn't ramped up to what we see now. And to me, I still connect it to, we were at a beginning point. And to think about how much it would ramp up at a time where the cityscape is changing so drastically. It's now defined by cranes and all of these other things. And so thinking about how the community posters and even the practice, like I said, the practice of absurdly well, the way that brings our eyes back down to kind of our level of the world. It allows us to slowly grapple with how DC is changing. I think moving back here after grad school, I found it very disorienting to come back to a city that has changed so much. So to a certain degree, to have those community posters still present in various forms provides this kind of moment of aesthetic design familiarity in a city that's changing just so rapidly.
And yeah, the important thing is community. When you're talking about gentrification, you're also talking about the erasure and the loss of community and the loss of a type of community. I think, with gentrification coming in, it was also this realization that there's a different type of community that's actually way more premised on individualism and not collaborating, and that's also been something to kind of wrap your head around. It's just there's different types of communities that are coming into these urban spaces, and there's a lot of glass and fanciness, and then more policing. So it's harder to get that message out, because it's also the community poster. It's you're wheat pasting it, you're putting it on things. But when you're in a gentrified area, that stuff's going to come down quick. So, I don't know.
Well, something that also strikes me as a big difference is as you go through the show upstairs, you've got these community posters that are commissions from institutions, right? So you're the ones that you chose to show, the Black Arts Festival at GW and the conference at Howard, where these institutions are being forced to shift, or they're in a change period. And then it's but it's not either or upstairs, there's also the new thing, and there's Art and Architecture Center, and there's also St. Margaret's Church, and there's also, so it's this, it's not there was an existence of community posters being commissioned for this kind of changing, self-determined, government, and Charles Cassell's campaign for school board, but also the independent spaces, right? It's not only absurdly well, and only Long Live Go-Go asserting a kind of a counter narrative, but the counter narrative had morphed into institutions.
Mhm.
And I think to build on that, Natalie, what really strikes me the most, because I did go through like some old newspaper coverage of the workshop, Lou Stovall and Lloyd McNeil. The newspaper documents document that these individuals were rooted in the community. You know, the reason that they got these commissions is because they were accessible, right? And just this idea, and even thinking about Lloyd McNeil, of letting your environment and your community influence your work, right? That comes out in what's produced through and through. So it's artist to artist, artist-community relationship, but it's also just being rooted in the community to have those institutional relationships.
And that's what I think, we're trying to do with No Moo No Moo, is like bring back the printmaking space as public space, or like, and printmaking knowledge as public knowledge, and just knowledge for the public. Because again, like with gentrification, you have a lot of privatization, a lot of monetization of space that should be for the public. And yeah, that's just something that was happening back then. It's like people were working together and art was accessible. And it's just not there right now.
That's reminding me of something that I've heard Lou talk about. He was a teacher to so many people, and he talked about the importance of making sure that printmaking was viewed as it should be, as an art form.
Mhm.
And so, Will, do you have any thoughts on your father's dedication to sort of making sure that printmaking was viewed wholly as an art form?
Mhm. Yeah. It's interesting to think about that question, and especially with the community poster and the way we're discussing it, as far as there's almost this sense of urgency in terms of, if there's a movement, there's an institution, there's the community, you almost want to just use the medium to communicate in a direct and strong way, in a way that maybe, in that sense, makes it seem that the craft could also almost get in the way of the individual messaging. So that is interesting to think that there would be a tension between the poster or the silkscreen print in general as a medium that can accommodate speaking and showing, and then for the viewer, reading and seeing in terms of visual messaging that, like in the collaboration of my dad with Lloyd McNeil's, kind of demarcated, where my dad did the hand lettering for the most part that he's passionate about, and is developing his own font essentially as he's developing his general practice in the medium. And Lloyd is making these tissue paper improvisational collages involving a meditation on the figure. They're bringing it together. So that's so interesting, because I wonder if there's a delight in the craft that just comes about naturally from collaboration in that way, of each one working with their own interests and learning from each other. And the posters that they made for the new thing in '67, they had their basis in drawings first, and then it wasn't until these posters from '68 that that the tissue paper element is involved. So
I don't know what happened. It just went to that. So.
No, that's. Can I also, ask the bus? Did you rent the bus for
The go-go truck?
bus? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking, I was kind of in preparation speaking with my parents about just public spaces. And one difference seems to be in the 60s, there seemed to be a sense of just knowing where to go. And for my parents, it was DuPont Circle. And my mom put it kind of in a frank way that you couldn't really just pick the front of the White House to congregate in, that you can't, you have to go there with a mass already assembled, in a sense that that it was really DuPont Circle where people kind of generating that energy of people coming together to form the public to move. So the New Thing posters, some of the earliest ones, these small ones that were printed for the New Thing Art and Architecture Center that were handed out by hand by Lloydton, my dad, and my mom at DuPont Circle for the concert series. And I think in terms of working in a community, they had the special kind of circumstance that there was already a community in DuPont Circle there that they could interact with. But I think putting that kind of on one side of the table, I think it's so special. The go-go bus, the truck, and that we're in a different relationship with urban spaces, but that doesn't mean there isn't a way to do something very different that creates, because that was in your video, that was the series, that was the public that you created.
Right, and we took the public with us. We went from 14th and U and then drove, I don't know where I actually didn't finish the march, I left. I was just handing out posters. But yeah, we had a few where everyone just followed us all the way down.
And I think when we think about that in the context of how DC is changing, in the 60s, there's a kind of, again, I say rootedness, of knowing where to go. Mm. But here, when we're making this intervention, how the landscape is changing, we have to move throughout, right? Mm-hmm. We have to move throughout. So I find that kind of intriguing.
Very much, yeah.
So, here you go.
Oh, well, and when Joseph, you produced the book of photographs from the movement, we selected one of the photographers, Kaina Uwaime, to put in the library's exhibit showing that moment. And when I interviewed her, she said that she didn't remember going to go-go clubs. That wasn't something that she did. It was something her older brother did. They didn't exist anymore. And so for her, the street protests and Mochella, that was the closest she felt she came to experiencing what her sister and brother grew up with.
Something that I'm curious about, to kind of loop back to something that Will said, was, I think, this idea of both showing and telling. Is the utility of the community poster integral to it being defined as that?
I think of it so. I guess I wonder about it because I was Melanee, your presentation, that was so amazing. Yeah, and I've been thinking about precursors kind of in terms of the media history of the community poster for some time. So what you've done, amazing. But so my kind of own, kind of things on my mind to kind of try my own way to kind of build precursors. I was very curious about the tradition of the legal emblem and the emblem book. So a kind of early Renaissance kind of compendium of commonplace wisdoms that had a graphical presentation, so engravings and then text and a poem. And a lot of them are kind of wisdoms in the sense of kind of two birds in a bush one bush and things like, you know what I mean. But there's a legal bird in hand, yeah, and that was illustrated. And there's a legal scholar, Peter Goodrich, who has a discussion of the legal emblem, so which also shows and tells. And his discussion begins with coats of arms as in medieval cities as kind of ways of of speech, visual language at a distance is one way. He talks about just the seal, like the emblazoned seal, and so it's a form of symbolic expression, and it's in public spaces and symbolic kind of assertions of whose space, kind of communication of kind of sovereign ownership of space kind of went hand in hand in his discussion. And so I think of that as a kind of mythology that the community poster is coming to, of kind of coming out of inverting that that relationship of power and have it be less that it's these elements, symbolic elements, are kind of communicating in a way that's totally inaccessible, whether it's kind of built physically into this architecture or in a way that the kind of means of productions of this image are just out of touch with a larger public body. But the community posters, I mean, two people in the case of Lloyd and my dad were making them together, putting them on buildings kind of on the outside, and in that way being able to kind of speak at a distance through the visual language of the poster and bring their voice into public space. So I think of that, the showing and telling, I think that's essential to, I mean, my view of the community poster of a message that maybe the speaking, the showing part is something that across the square, across the DuPont circle, across the street, you can kind of see it, and then before that kind of like draws you closer to get that verbal information.
I have a question for Joseph. How did you get into printmaking?
School. I took a class. But I really got into it because it's like it's just accessible. It doesn't feel like a waste of time, I guess, when you're making art. Like when you're making a painting, you're like, stupid. But when you're like, but when you're like making a message for people, or like you're trying to convey, like in a painting, it becomes this very rarefied object that has some internal symbolism that no one can really, it's better off if it's mystified, makes it more expensive. I don't know how painting, like for market, but like for when you're considering people and this is going to be in the street, what's the best way to like get their attention? What's the best way to like word it so that it stays in their head? And like, what's the, aesthetically, how do you make it something that they want? Or like they feel more real, like just something I want to do, and yeah, and that's why I really got into, and it's also like easy to learn, right? Which we've been doing these, it's fun, and it's like immediately rewarding because then you have your thing. You just do this, then you have the thing. It's cool. Sorry, go ahead.
No, because I feel like I'm waiting for you to say something. It's, as long as I've known Joseph as an artist, he also is very much like, bump the system, turn the system upside down. So I always see his commitment to printmaking as this kind of affront to things around the art market. You've kind of spoken to that a little bit, but I feel like your commitment to printmaking is just like a big, forget the system.
It's the medium that was like revolutionary, right?
Yes.
Printmaking, and like when it became accessible, it became, the Panthers could market themselves. Like they put the People's Food Program on the bags and then they were creating their own newspapers and like creating counter narratives. That's the potential. It's still there.
So you're talking about like the function of the poster was
function
something that-
of taking the means of production, giving back to the people.
Mhm.
Like, it's through these printmaking and like writing.
And that's what I was waiting for.
Right.
That line right there.
Giving back.
Taking back the means of production.
Yeah. Yeah, and you've also spoken about it in terms of mutuality, right? Like when you made when we had a chance to work together, you were doing those gradient backgrounds, and people in the libraries got to take a print that was made on these beautiful gradients that were printed on the Globe presses, right? And then we kept a copy. It's like you just wanted people to actually have something beautiful that they could, they can learn to make it themselves, best case scenario, and do it themselves, or they can just take away something that you've made and given.
Yeah, and it's mind blowing. You're saying your dad was just giving out these posters in DuPont, like what?
Yeah.
These posters that are so beautiful. I mean, it's hard. I mean, I don't know. I guess the difficulty right now with running a space and really experiencing like how people could consume art is that, like I was saying before, there's like a lack of reverence for the image because there's so much consumption. And what I'm trying to do now is like kind of wrap my head around how do we address that? And I do think it's still just like getting people to understand that they can be artists. It's not something exclusive. It's really a human instinct.
Well, I think what's interesting is because it's accessible and because these community posters were serving a function, they then become later on a resource. And so what I'm interested in hearing is how, I guess this is more for like Melanee and Natalie, like how have you used these posters as a resource? And I know Melanee, you've kind of talked about that, but just going further into that.
You want to go first, Natalie?
Well, the library, on the, I will say that the public library where I work, I come from an art background, but my role there is more related to local history, and I don't work in the archives department. I work in exhibits, which works really closely with archives, which collects not artwork, but archival collections. And I would say that there's this kind of magical thing that happens. I give a shout out to my colleague who is working in the archives, Ray Barker, who's in the audience, who has been doing work over the years where we're allowed to kind of document art space oral histories, right? And so I think what kind of organically happens as you present, he did an interview with Lou and Di, he did an and organically as you start to do these histories, someone comes out of the woodwork and says, I want to donate these posters to the library collection, and and you see how much the art history is imbued in people's, memory and social history of the time. And so we have a few graphic arts items in the collections that are really just part of that history. And so we try to show that we have some of that stuff and I think and help people understand this incredibly rich, the materials that we have related to this incredibly rich time period. But
I think I would just extend your comments, Natalie, that, I think they're artifacts. As an art historian, I approach every artwork as an artifact, literally. So, but in teaching Washington, D.C., so this summer I had the pleasure of actually teaching a class about cultural geographies of Black D.C. And again, going back to thinking about the function of these posters, not only in public space, but also what it meant to go into an African-American home and see these framed, right? And then hear the stories behind why they have a Roberta Flack Day poster in their home, right? Oh, because I saw Roberta Flack at Rock Creek Park, right? Or I remember when she was a student at Howard University. It allows this kind of portal to tell the story about DC as this truly multifaceted aesthetic space that, it really doesn't get the credit for it. Like we love talking about Sam Gillen, we love talking about Howard and everyone that comes from that, but it's so much more complex. And I mean, for a lack of better words, just interdisciplinary. And it's not just visual arts, it's not just theater, it's not just music. It's all of these things simultaneously at the same time creating something dynamic. So artifact, but also this aesthetic portal that transports us into the real heartbeat, cultural heartbeat of DC.
I feel like the multimedia part really does come up when you're going back through the show. You're like, oh, this was for this dance performance, this was for this, this was for this.
And the exhibition at the library is just so effective in doing that. And across sounds, across objects, you see objects that you remember from your family's home, and it just brings everything back. So.
Can you talk a little bit about the exhibition that's happening at the library?
There's a permanent exhibition that really grew. It's on the 4th floor of MLK, and the art is a small piece. We had 2 kind of mandates when the MLK library was modernized, and one was to include more history about why the library was named for Dr. King. There was a lot of, demand for that, and there were also and there was a strong demand from the public to just understand more about what's in the collections, which have been really working over the past, I'd say, 10 years or so to strengthen their collecting focus on local history and not make it a general collection and certain themes, social justice, Black Washington, and so it's really just there's a story about the civil right. DC is a civil rights place that Martin Luther King came to. And had strong connections to with several local activists. But what's interesting is when you go to the east side of the gallery, you see that a lot of those people got involved in the self-determination movement for DC, and that there was all this culture. And I feel like it's just a tiny piece of what, say, the Anacostia Community Museum was able to communicate in the Right to the City exhibition about this incredible moment where it was culturally and politically and socially so much change. I mean, I do think about that now in terms of all the comparisons you're making to 2020. Yes, there's a period of upheaval, but is there that sense of taking power and shaping our spaces and institutions? Or
that's a good question,
Natalie.
Well, I'm curious, at what point does a poster become an artifact? Is it after if it's publicizing an event, is it right after that event takes place?
The posters were collected into museum collections as early as 1969. So one of the first was Sun Ra, the poster collaboration between Lloyd and my dad for a Corcoran Gallery of Art performance in, I believe, summer '68. And so almost contemporaneously with that, it was collected by Jacob Kanan, so artist, and then curator at the now Smithsonian American Art Museum, but National Collection was the name. So that's one side of it. The other, my dad has in his autobiographical writings a wonderful story of a poster thief, and it's one of his favorite stories of he and my mom going to a party at someone's house and seeing all their posters on this person's walls. So they were made for public spaces, but they were being collected by interested people even at the same time. So that was a surprise to them. So where does it become art and artifact? I think, well, actually, could I say one more? Because I was thinking about the craft element too, that when Melanee and Joseph were speaking just now, to one one thing I think that's so important to think about as far as the craft that was being brought into the poster is that my dad and Lloyd, coming out of Howard, their classmates, in addition to Roberta Flack, included
Sylvia Snowden,
Mary
Lovelace
yeah.
O'Neill. And I feel like one person we're also maybe forgetting that may have been there is Mildred Thompson, who's creating these wooden structural reliefs and thinking about abstraction and figuration. So
Yeah.
it's like, and then Driscoll's still there teaching, and Lois Mailey Jones is there, and Wells is there. It's, to be honest, I remember Dr. Driscoll saying like the 60s was the golden age of Howard. And of course, those of us that are at Howard are like, well, hold on, what are we doing? But when you think about those names lined up, it becomes something quite spectacular. And then also, I believe Stokely Carmichael would have been there as a student as well. So Howard had this really specific spirit amongst the students at the time.
Exactly. Yeah. So in that way, how can you not kind of want to make, I mean, if those are your classmates, that's something to live up to. And then on the institutional side, you mentioned Stokely Carmichael, and I'm thinking of the array of institutions toward the project of self-determination that were taking place in DC. So there's a creative spirit for institution creation, and so the New Thing Art and Architecture Center was one, Gaston Neal's New School for African American Thought and Liberation. And then one of, I believe DC's first African American owned bookstore, Drum and Spear, and two very important organizers of that are here, Tony Giddens and Jennifer Lawson. And Tony Giddens was an organizer of the Howard sit-ins in April '68, of which in November, the Tour to Black University Conference poster came out of that. So creativity all around.
All around, I don't know. I think the art historian in me, Camille, wants to say, as soon as it leaves the artist's hands, it's an artifact because it still commemorates, documents that event that will happen. But then all of the life energy it accumulates along the way, it's just like icing on the cake. But I don't know. What do you think, Joey? Is it when it leaves your
once
hand?
it's done. I mean, I like keep prints that I make mistakes on because I'm just like, ooh, this one's, I don't know, messed up, but I like it. And then it's an artifact now. So yeah, I mean, right when it's done, it becomes its own thing. Like,
Maybe once you're not allowed to put holes in it anymore, or like put tape on it, then it's an artifact. You take it off the.
Well, we're kind of, we're approaching a close, and I want to make sure we have time to answer any audience questions that people may have. Do we have a microphone? I see a question over here.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to say, I agree with you about artifact, because I believe one of the meanings of fact, the root is to make. So the second it's made, it's a made art, it's instant. But the other thing I wanted to say, when you were talking about things being rapidly torn down, I was thinking, well, what around here is permanent is the murals. The murals are, and they're in just really weird places you wouldn't expect. They do say something about what people around there maybe, if it's not the artist's vision, the people are thinking about, even though it doesn't have print on it, to see if from afar, as you were talking about, but the murals are there. And I think that's really important also, because that's also an expression of what people are doing and how they're feeling.
When I was going through the Washington Post kind of documentation of the workshop, there's this one kind of brilliant spread that shows this public mural that I think McNeil and Stovall worked on, where they literally are just affixing these canvases to a wall, essentially. I think you're spot on. It's to a certain degree, it's a little misleading, actually, to talk about community posters, to not think about the mural movement, which at Howard was full steam by the 60s. I mean, in fact, Huey Lee Smith, the painter, starts Howard's mural program, I believe, in 1959. So Howard University becomes a space that I can't imagine wouldn't have influenced them, a printmaker, to think, you know, how can I make an intervention in that public space? So thank you for bringing up murals, because that's an important piece to the puzzle. And then we could even talk about public sculpture that happens much later. It's like an ongoing conversation. So thank you.
Or graffiti, yeah.
Well, that's actually what I was going to
Oh.
say. I wasn't going to say anything, but I just have to respectfully disagree about the murals, because part of what I don't like about it, part of the reason I don't do them, is because how it's treated in DC. It's basically, and they have a word now, art washing, but you know, the only reason there's a party wall that doesn't have any windows is because it's adjoining an adjacent property, and you can't put a window because another building can be built next to it. So it's basically a placeholder, usually. And so construction fences where they have these commissions for artists to make the construction fences, murals that are in places that are bound to be covered over as soon as the adjacent property can be assembled, and so on. You know, and the whole framing of things as arts. I mean, there's a million buildings that are arts this, arts that, and there's not an artist within 1,000 feet or that can afford to live there or work there. So it's basically like kind of like game, you know? And so it's covered for the same gentrification that we're talking about. And, you know, that's just me talking. But I think that, first of all, I love the whole discussion. I think that graffiti has to come into the conversation, because graffiti faced the same issue that you're talking about, where, you know, it comes down. There's a whole department that goes around just painting over stuff, you know? And if we had a more organic, you know, like in Philly, which is my hometown, the mural thing is organically grew out of graffiti. And it's something that was grassroots, where it was community built. And so people don't write on top of a beautiful mural in the city, dare not paint over it, whether it was, you know, legally done or not, you know. But I'd be interested to hear you guys talk about graffiti as a public art that it is illegal to do, just like it's illegal to wheat paste on something, you know. And I definitely agree with what you said. It's an artifact the moment it was created, you know. And part of what I love about the protest poster is that you decide what it's worth. Maybe it's worth nothing. You know, some people got that thing handed to them in DuPont Circle and said, oh, that's cool. They dropped it on the ground. You know, they threw it out the first trash can they got. Another person took it home and framed it. You know, and now, all these years later, it's, you know, a treasure. So it's all about what the person, it's what you receive it to be and how you perceive it to be.
I think I want to speak to his first point, if I can, very quickly. I think you're drawing the distinction between, I think, a great development that has happened around mural art in DC, and this kind of co-opting of murals as something that frames the community but speaks back to a larger community. And I mean, it would be really interesting for someone to do a master's thesis or a dissertation to really compare and contrast the mural movement of the 60s and 70s at Howard, which really pushed a lot of debate about what public art should do in DC, and then compare how it's been used now. I mean, I actually have a student who was an intern here as an MFA student, and she did this mural piece for Rhode Island Avenue, where they're doing all of that construction with the, and she came back a year later and her painting had been marked and tagged, and it just crushed her. Like, she wasn't ready. And she's from New York, so I'm not, you know, I didn't understand why she was so broken about it, but it did let me know that, you know, our students at Howard need a little bit more guidance on how to navigate the demand for art in this gentrification landscape, where their work may not always be valued in a particular way.
And I've been thinking about that too, because I've been, running this space in Baltimore, and the amount of political education that artists need is immense. I mean, when in 2020, when everyone started boarding up their windows because they were afraid people were going to break into them, like they also had all these artists like paint this stuff that was just totally superficial. A lot of these businesses do not care. But, I didn't say anything. I was busy, but I knew, I wanted to be like, what are y'all doing? Do not participate with these businesses. They don't care. Like, they are structurally part of the structure of this racist system. Like, and the way the arts are instrumentalized to placate tension it's something that needs to be really articulated and like conveyed to artists, but like there's not. The education isn't.
I was gonna say, I'm even tempted to say, it lets me know as an art historian that we're still processing public art from the 80s. I mean, I think of David Hammond's How You Like Me Now, or even the bus campaigns in New York addressing AIDS. I mean, I'm not sure that we've unpacked that and understood how that shifted how we engage with images and activists' statements in public arenas. So I just think we have a lot of work to do to even understand how art is functioning now. Still have to unpack a couple decades ago.
Hi, that's awesome.
I see some questions over here.
Yeah, hi, I just wanted to make
Sorry.
a comment. Yeah, just want to make a comment. And give Lou and, I want to give him a little, his due and his acknowledgement. Like, when they started doing what they were doing, him and Lloyd, that there was no internet. I mean, there was no cell phone. And if you were trying to get in touch with a lot of people about something, you couldn't call them up, you couldn't put them online and let people know. You had to find a way to physically go and hand out the flyers on some corner, be it DuPont Circle or downtown or at Howard. You had to give them a piece of paper so that and you'd have to physically do it. And before Lou started doing stuff, you just go get a Xerox machine and you'd get somebody to write something on a piece of paper and hand it out. But when you went to Lou and you said, look, Lou, I need a flyer, Lou could not just simply do that. Anything he touched and put out there had to have an artistic element to it. Mm-hmm. So he took this idea, these concepts, these announcements for meetings, these announcements for conferences, and he would turn that message into art. And he found a way to do it inexpensively. And these posters that are in the museums now, I mean, after the event, I guess it became an artifact after the event, that there'd be $5 and $10, $20. And you would take them, as you pointed out, and put them in your home. But they did that. They did that transition from this community communication and announcement and turned it into art. That Lloyd brought the, I don't want to say the beauty to it, but the artistic, creative part to it. But Lou functionally figured out how you could take that and turn it into basic little flyers that you could hand out inexpensively and then make it available to people inexpensively. I mean, what they did was a transition. It was a sea change right there. And then other people and other organizations began to do it. But it was because of what Lou and his team brought to it that just changed the whole thing. I just want to give Lou some acknowledgement for that.
And as you were speaking, I also kept thinking like his rootedness in the community. Like he had faith in his aesthetic interventions that it was going to translate to a large public. It's audacious, but it also suggests the way in which he just knew the community that he was serving and creating for us.
And I love how that material commitment comes out in the show. The furniture that he built for students at the center, like teaching people, giving them the tools, taking up the space, building the thing. And there was also something in the oral history I was listening to where he said that if you got a commission from a federal agency, you would have more money, you could put more colors in something, and if there was little money, then you would just have fewer colors. It was like there was no question that there would be a poster. So like the level of material commitment. I love that that way that it is like that act of liberation outside of the even though the material plays an important role, and he had to get the space, he had to build the thing, he had to invest all that stuff that you can see upstairs.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful discussion. And my question is, what's happening today in the digital realm with posters? Think of Instagram. I mean, could you speak to that? I mean, is there an opposition? What's happening?
Somebody take that.
I mean, what is happening, Joe?
What is happening?
In my mind, I do
terrible.
remember a particular high point around Mochella, and that having a digital face to a certain degree. But I must say,
No, Facebook took over and ruined everything. It's just it doesn't make any sense. And I mean, aesthetically, I think right now,
go ahead, finish your thought.
I just see a lot of, I mean, I don't know, this is from an aesthetic perspective, I don't know what people are, they're just kind of borrowing from the past 90s and trying to, it's just, there's nothing, it's nothing. It's like,
Yeah. It's a presence, but I think there's a lot of suspicion around control.
It's controlled.
And I think that's the only thing that comes up. Because I think you're right. I think there are new relationships that have been fostered. I mean, being able to see, similar impressions, it creates something. But I mean, Facebook and all these algorithms and the sexism, the racism, all the isms embedded in these algorithms, I know a lot of activists have pulled back to say, hold on.
You got to be careful because you're also being monitored. And a lot of people, I mean, the power
20 years from now, we'll find out that we have digital files from our Instagram and Facebook that the CIA or somebody has been collecting. I think to a certain degree, I do feel like the digital realm is still kind of the wild, wild west. So
I feel like there's a movement to step away from that. The Twitter, Instagram, I think the potential, it reached its potential, it's how it communicates, people are able, it's reached its limits. There's no, and with Facebook buying it, or acquiring it, and then Elon Musk buying Twitter, forget it. I mean, and I do think, and I don't know what's next, I do think maybe, hopefully, it's going back to the poster and going back to the streets.
And it is, I mean, now NFTs pose a different framing for how we deal with graphic aesthetic elements. So I'm
weird.
still working through it, trying to keep up. I know it's present there, and I also know there's elements of suspicion and trying to understand the role of corporate and all these other elements in the digital realm. So thank you for pushing us to think a little further about that before we just write it off.
Should I answer? Oh,
yes, absolutely.
Thank you. This has been a great discussion, and it's a wonderful, wonderful exhibition. I had two quick questions. I grew up in Washington, and I was born in 1958. So from 68 to 72, when you're 10 years old to 15 or whatever, very pivotal time of everything that was happening. So what you mentioned, Will, is my recollection. I mean, that was probably my home with all the posters on the wall. And it became quickly not only a symbol of what was happening, but I recall people started collecting. They started, I mean, it wasn't just an artifact, it was an art form. And I think now also there is this tremendous sense of emotion, not nostalgia, but just emotion when I was going through the exhibition of that time and it being this juxtaposition of what was happening and the beautiful artwork at the same time. So my question though is the influence of color, just purely from an artistic, the influence of Washington Color School in the community poster. If you can just comment on that or whether that was part of it, if you can just comment from an artistic point of view.
I think, Will, do you want to talk about the Washington Color School? I think I want to start off by talking about Howard and printmaking. Because I would say over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of new research on what James Wells was doing for all of those decades at Howard. And I know that there is a curator at the National Gallery of Art. Their prints curator has been doing some research on Elizabeth Catlett and looking at her introduction to color in those years around Howard, right? So for me, when I think about color, I just think about the genius that I don't think we still have tapped in terms of our knowledge of James Wells and how he was really giving his students the tools to push printmaking further than it had ever gone. Because there is like a two-tone print, I think, of Negro Woman that Catlett does that, I mean, it's not a saturated color in your face like a Lichtenstein, but you see color being integrated before we see it in pop art that next decade. Like those rumblings are happening at Howard. So that's gonna be my thought on color. Stay tuned. I think that there's a bigger story about printmaking and color at Howard that is gonna be shared with you all in upcoming exhibitions. So I'll pass it to Will.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited for that. I think, yeah, it's a hard question for me to answer. Well, I'm thinking the piece poster, the 5-part piece poster, that, as my parents describe it as a, I should say first, when we first uncovered it, it was the A first, and they had, it was, their memory of it was a big surprise to them. So it's not one that they were even knew that they made, which was the case with a lot of these pieces. But that was done as a demonstration piece, movement-based piece, where they each was poster was held individually, and they were printed in a single color. And so, talking to my parents, the story and memory they were kind of that was coming to them, kind of talking about it more was it was really a color. What we see in that print was a color experiment of having these letters and a stencil that they really loved, and my dad just wanting to experiment and play with the colors. So I think his interest in 67, 68 was a more kind of formal one of using the cutting instrument, the knife, perfecting the letter, so formal visual language lettering, and with the exception of pieces like the big piece. But yes, I mean, it's hard to not think that in 69, when he starts printing for Paul Reed first, and then Gene Davis, that a lot changed as far as color, and a really striking one is this 1970 anti-war poster that was for a march on an anniversary of Huey Newton, and I think was that at Fort Reed? I can't remember the exact location but it's these flames, and they're a kind of a hard-edged stripe, almost like flames. And I think that to think, I'm not exactly sure what in the color school at first made my dad. It's something I'm going to be thinking about a lot, so thank you. But I know I'm thinking of, there's a Washington Star article where Paul Reed's the artist of the color school that my dad first worked with, just wondering about the hard-edged nature of being able to cut silkscreen stencils with a knife, and how that's just a great vehicle for a color field idea of kind of pure color. And so I do wonder if it's something about that space that's defined, that one color can pass through or another, that is just something about, I think in that collaboration when I think Dad really felt like he had perfected that use of the knife, because I was thinking that in that poster from '70, you can see kind of the same approach that he would later do for Jacob Lawrence in the 80s and 90s of kind of just that it's all there. Like I think his practice has really arrived at that point in 1970, and that I think in that way, once he had kind of felt like he had perfected registration, the knife, and this way of being able to bring successive stencils into a single print, it was just, now color was like just this connector that he was ready to kind of just have a world just explore onto itself. So
nothing intellectual will follow. But I was with your dad and Lloyd as an architecture student, and I worked for free. So the Washington Gallery Modern Art, Walter Hopps, the gonzo curator, always invited us to come down and work for free. So we did lots of things. But Intercourse 68 was Lloyd and your dad's. And so, what do I remember? I probably would make up half of it. But it was immersive. I mean, I was whatever I was an architect. But I'd never been in an environment that was so exciting. And yet it was not top down. I mean, nobody seemed to tell anybody, this is what you ought to do. The opening was like a happening. I mean, it was fabulous. We had projectors, and Lloyd's group, they're playing, and drummers stop. And I just, it's wonderful that I'm kind of reconnecting in this little way. And I think it was that really interesting site, 365 days, 1968, that McWhorter did. Anyway, I bumped into it, and one of her questions was, what kind of brushes does Lloyd, and there was a picture. So every day there was something happened in DC that was not the riots. It was it's just looking at my town on a daily basis. And it was, what kind of brushes does Lloyd use? I thought, I have no idea, but I was there. So I got in touch with her, and she just, it's been wonderful. And I know this young man on the stage because he played soccer with our kids, and his mom was a coach, and as I was. So DC is a great city, and I think that your parents, what they did at the time, and what people now have done to remember. I'm due a poster from Walter Hopps. I have the letter. I never got my poster. And I've been chasing.
Are you just here to complain?
I've been chasing. I brought the letter. Somebody must have. But here's where I'll end up, is that I realized that what I remember, as inaccurate as it might be, but my recollections are more valuable to me than hanging the poster on the wall. Nothing against the poster on the wall. I mean, we used to have lots of, but I get to remember this stuff, and it's because of events like this and being with other people that know a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and hearing professionals describe what really was happening, which I was not cognizant of. Free work. Anyway, that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, we have a question up here. And then are there any other questions? Okay, this might be our last one.
Thank you so much to everyone on the panel. It was really wonderful to hear about what was happening in the 60s in DC. And I am a poster thief. I only take them after the event has passed. Okay, so if the event is still going on, I would never take it. But something that always has upset me about certain posters, and maybe you guys know why, and this is my question. Why is it that a lot of posters don't tell you the year? They'll just tell you the days, okay? Is it because there's not enough space? Or like you should know what the year is? Like why? That's my question. I know it's very silly and basic, but.
I will leave that to the practitioners.
It's because I guess it's you assume you're not promoting an event next year, you know.
It's gonna rain
like
before
April,
then.
something for October.
So it's like the efficiency of communication.
Yeah,
right?
it's just like, I mean,
bare
that's a
minimum.
good, I mean, I don't think anyone's thinking about like archiving.
But it's frustrating as an artist. It really is.
Right? And I'm thinking like, oh, all these posters, I wish I knew the exact year, you know?
I think one of my favorites from the exhibit, Dance Tonight, 8 p.m. So that's a wonderful.
No location,
yeah.
no colors, no
Two
address,
colors.
nothing.
No money, 2 colors.
Yeah, no day. Yeah.
No day. I love it.
Well, I want to sincerely thank all of you for being with us this afternoon. I want to thank Joseph and Dr. Harvey, Will, and Natalie for being here. This was wonderful, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.